Mindanao storm night, rain hammering the flooded runway like machine gun fire. 8 Navy SEALs pressed against a crumbling concrete wall, ammunition gone, hope fading with each lightning flash. This is our last breath. Above the chaos, jet engines roared through the tempest. In the C-130 cockpit, Captain Laura Hayes gripped the controls with steady hands. Steel blue eyes focused through the storm, her small frame dwarfed by the massive aircraft she commanded with surgical precision. Against all logic, the transport giant dove toward the submerged runway. Stay until the end, and you'll understand why even the storm itself seemed to salute that impossible landing. Meet Captain Laura Hayes, 29 years old, standing barely 5 feet 4 in her flight boots. Honey blonde hair pulled back in regulation style, revealing a face that carried the quiet intensity of someone who'd learned early that actions mattered more than words. She was the daughter of a Texas aircraft mechanic who'd raised her in hangars filled with the thunder of jet engines. While other kids played with dolls, Laura was learning about lift coefficients and thrust-to-weight ratios. Her father would hoist her onto his shoulders so she could watch planes take off, explaining how metal could dance with air currents to achieve the impossible. "Flying isn't magic, little bird," he'd say. "It's physics married to courage." Now she commanded a C-130 Hercules in the storm-battered Philippines, assigned to what most pilots considered punishment duty. Cargo runs through typhoon season in some of the most dangerous airspace on Earth. But Laura never complained, never requested transfer to easier assignments. She understood that someone had to fly the routes nobody else wanted, and she'd rather it be someone who actually cared about bringing people home alive. The distress call had come through at 0347 hours. 8 Navy SEALs stranded on a forward operating base as Typhoon Rosa turned their extraction point into a lake. The primary runway was under 3 feet of water. Secondary landing zones were completely inaccessible. Helicopter rescue was impossible in winds exceeding 90 knots. Command had been debating options for 6 hours while the SEALSC situation deteriorated by the minute. A C-130 cannot land on a submerged strip, Colonel Morrison had stated flatly during the emergency briefing. If she tries this stunt, she'll kill them all instead of saving them. Other pilots nodded in agreement. "She's too young, too reckless," they whispered behind her back. Hayes thinks she can rewrite the laws of physics. But Laura carried something they didn't understand. In her left chest pocket, carefully preserved in waterproof plastic, was a worn silver patch that had belonged to her father. Staff Sergeant Miguel Hayes, crew chief turned emergency pilot, who'd once landed a damaged transport in an Iraqi sandstorm to extract Marines from an impossible situation. He died 6 months later in another rescue attempt, but not before teaching his daughter that some missions were worth any risk. During off-duty hours, while other pilots relaxed in the officers' club, Laura studied weather patterns and runway conditions with obsessive detail. She calculated load factors, analyzed wind shear data, and memorized the performance limitations of every aircraft in the fleet. Not because she was required to, but because somewhere out there, people were depending on pilots who understood that textbook limitations were just starting points for creative solutions. The red flare had appeared on radar at 0952 hours. Emergency signal. Last resort. The kind of desperate plea that meant people were about to die without immediate intervention. Laura looked up from her navigation charts, those steel blue eyes reflecting the storm lightning flickering outside the operations center. She spoke 2 words that changed everything. "Set course for the strip." Colonel Morrison stepped forward. "Hayes, that runway is completely flooded. Visibility is 0. Wind shear is off the charts. This isn't heroism. It's suicide." "Sir," Laura replied with calm precision, 8 Americans are going to die if someone doesn't try. I'd rather die trying than live knowing I didn't." She gathered her flight gear and headed toward the hangar, where her C-130 waited like a sleeping giant. Each step carried the weight of her father's legacy and the lives of men she'd never met but was determined to save. The storm raged with biblical fury outside, but Laura Hayes had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Where are you watching from? If you were on that flooded strip, what would your first emotion be? The C-130's 4 turboprops spun to life with mechanical thunder that could be heard above the typhoon's roar. Laura ran through her pre-flight checklist with methodical precision, each switch and gauge confirmation, bringing her closer to an attempt that defied every safety protocol in military aviation. Above them, the storm raged with terrifying intensity. Lightning turned night into fractured daylight every few seconds. Rain struck the cockpit windows like bullets, and wind gusts rocked the 40-ton aircraft as if it were made of paper. On the ground 8 miles away, the SEALs huddled in whatever shelter they could find. Water had risen past their ankles, then their knees, and was now approaching waist-deep in some areas. Their last functioning radio crackled with static and fading battery power. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez pressed his back against the concrete wall and pulled out a waterlogged notebook. With shaking hands, he wrote what he believed would be his final message. "Tell my family I tried. Tell them I loved them until the end." The others watched in silence, each man confronting his own mortality as the storm continued its relentless assault. Laura's voice crackled through their radio one last time. "Hang tight down there. Cavalry's coming." Her father's words echoed in her memory as she guided the massive transport into the teeth of the typhoon. "Flying isn't about clear skies, little bird. It's about staying steady when the storm tries to break you apart." The C-130 bucked and rolled through turbulence that would have grounded smaller aircraft. Laura fought the controls with both hands, feeling every gust try to tear the plane from her grip. Sweat mixed with condensation on her face as she descended through layers of wind shear that threatened to flip them inverted. Through the rain-streaked windscreen, she could barely make out the runway lights reflecting off the flooded surface. The landing strip looked like a river, completely submerged under churning water that sparkled with each lightning flash. Every instinct, every hour of training, every safety protocol she'd ever learned screamed that this was impossible. C-130s were not designed to land on water. The impact would either tear the landing gear off or send them skidding uncontrollably into the jungle. But 8 Americans were about to die, and Laura Hayes was the only person in position to prevent that tragedy. She reduced power and adjusted her approach angle, feeling the aircraft settle into what pilots call the slot, that narrow corridor of airspeed and descent rate where controlled flight becomes controlled crash. The runway rushed up to meet them through sheets of driving rain. Laura could see individual waves on the flooded surface, could count the runway lights disappearing beneath churning water. 50 feet, 40, 30. "Come on, girl," she whispered to her aircraft. "Show me what you're made of." 20 feet, 10. The moment of impact arrived like a thunderclap. The C-130's main landing gear struck the submerged runway with tremendous force, sending geysers of water exploding in all directions. The aircraft shuddered and bounced, threatening to porpoise out of control. But Laura had calculated everything perfectly. The water was deep enough to cushion the initial impact, but shallow enough that the runway surface provided stability. The massive transport hydroplaned across the flooded strip like a giant water ski, engines screaming in reverse thrust. From their sheltered position, the SEALs watched in stunned amazement as 40 tons of American military aircraft performed what could only be described as a miracle. The C-130 slowed, turned, and taxied through knee-deep water toward their position like some mechanical sea monster emerging from the depths. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stared at the approaching aircraft, with tears mixing with rainwater on his weathered face. "She's really doing it," he whispered. "That crazy pilot is actually doing it." The cargo ramp lowered with hydraulic precision, revealing the brightly lit interior of the transport. Laura's voice echoed from the cockpit speakers with calm authority. "Welcome aboard, gentlemen. Let's go home." One by one, the SEALs splashed through the flooded runway toward salvation. They moved with the careful urgency of men who couldn't quite believe they were going to live through this nightmare. As they climbed aboard, each man paused to look toward the cockpit where their rescuer sat calmly running post-landing checklists. They could see her small silhouette framed against the instrument panel, blonde hair visible beneath her flight helmet, hands moving with surgical precision across controls that had just performed the impossible. The cargo ramp sealed with mechanical finality. Laura advanced the throttles, and the C-130 began its takeoff roll through water that would have been considered impassable just minutes before. The aircraft lifted off into the storm-torn sky, carrying 8 men who had accepted death but found life instead in the courage of a pilot who refused to accept the word impossible. What would you do if the world called it impossible? would you still try? As the C-130 climbed through the turbulent night sky, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez made his way forward to thank their pilot personally. The cargo hold was dimly lit, filled with the steady drone of engines and the occasional groan of metal adjusting to altitude changes. When he reached the cockpit area, Rodriguez noticed something that made him pause mid-step. There, clearly visible on Laura's flight jacket, was a silver patch he hadn't seen in over 15 years. "Wait," he said, his voice barely audible above the engine noise. "Isn't that Crew Senior's patch? The pilot who saved us in Iraq?" The other SEALs gathered around, squinting at the worn insignia that seemed oddly familiar. Chief Petty Officer Williams, a 20-year veteran who'd served in 3 different theaters, suddenly straightened with recognition. "Miguel Hayes," he whispered. "Staff Sergeant Miguel Hayes, maintenance crew chief who learned to fly during Operation Iraqi Freedom." The memory came flooding back to all of them. July 2003, outside Fallujah. Their unit had been pinned down in a bombed-out school building, surrounded by insurgents and running low on ammunition. Helicopter extraction was impossible due to sustained ground fire from multiple positions. That's when an aging C-130 had appeared through the smoke and chaos, piloted by a maintenance sergeant who'd never officially qualified for combat operations. Miguel Hayes had landed that transport on a road barely wide enough for a truck, loaded the Marines under heavy fire, and taken off through a hail of bullets that left his aircraft looking like Swiss cheese. He saved 23 Marines that day, Rodriguez continued, his voice thick with emotion. Command tried to court-martial him for flying without proper authorization, but the story went public. Made him a hero instead. Williams nodded slowly. And 6 months later, he volunteered for another impossible rescue mission, Syrian border. Aircraft went down in a sandstorm trying to extract special forces. Never made it home. Laura's voice crackled through the intercom system, cutting through their conversation. "Gentlemen, we'll be landing at Clark Air Base in approximately 45 minutes. Medical personnel are standing by, and hot coffee is waiting in the terminal." She didn't acknowledge their discussion, didn't offer explanations or seek recognition. Just focused on flying them safely through the worst weather conditions any of them had ever experienced. But Rodriguez wasn't finished connecting the pieces. "Hayes," he called toward the cockpit. "Laura Hayes, you're Miguel's daughter." There was a long pause before her voice returned, softer this time, but still maintaining professional composure. "Yes, Sergeant. Miguel Hayes was my father. The revelation hit the SEALs like a physical force. The daughter of the legendary pilot who'd saved their brothers in Iraq had just saved them in the Philippines, performing the same kind of impossible rescue that had defined her father's legacy." "Ma'am," Williams spoke up, his voice carrying the respect of a career soldier addressing someone who'd earned their place in military legend. "Your father saved my squad leader in Fallujah, Tommy Martinez, kid from El Paso who was engaged to his high school sweetheart." "He married her," Laura replied simply. "They have 3 kids now. Tommy sends Christmas cards." The simple statement carried profound meaning. Her father's sacrifice hadn't just saved lives. It had enabled futures, families, generations that wouldn't have existed without his courage. Chief Morrison, the youngest SEAL on the team, leaned forward hesitantly. "Ma'am, I have to ask, did you know who we were when you came to get us? Did you know there was a connection?" "Negative," Laura responded with characteristic directness. "I knew there were 8 Americans who needed extraction from an impossible situation. That was sufficient information to make my decision." The answer revealed something profound about her character. She hadn't attempted this rescue because of personal connections or family history. She'd risked everything simply because it was the right thing to do. Because people were in danger and she had the skills to help them. "Just like your father," Rodriguez said quietly. "My father taught me that some people wear uniforms to advance their career," Laura continued, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and sadness. "Others wear them to serve something larger than themselves. He showed me the difference through his actions, not his words." The cargo hold fell silent, except for the steady rhythm of engines carrying them through the storm. Each SEAL was processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Not just their rescue, but the realization that they'd witnessed the continuation of a heroic legacy. Williams pulled out his phone and began scrolling through military databases, accessing personnel records and after-action reports. What he discovered made his hands tremble slightly. Jesus, he whispered, showing his screen to Rodriguez. She's been doing this for 3 years. Solo rescue missions in impossible conditions. Somalia, Afghanistan, Syria, always listed as routine transport operations in the official reports. The pattern was unmistakable. Wherever American forces found themselves in desperate situations that conventional rescue couldn't reach, Captain Laura Hayes seemed to appear with solutions that defied standard operating procedures. She's been ghostwriting rescue operations across 3 theaters, Rodriguez observed, flying missions that shouldn't be survivable, saving people who should have been written off as casualties. Laura's voice interrupted their discoveries. Gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Clark. Please secure any loose gear and prepare for landing. As the C-130 descended towards safety, 8 Navy SEALs sat in awed silence, understanding that they'd been rescued by someone who represented the very best of American military service. A pilot who flew not for recognition or advancement, but because courage was simply woven into her DNA. The landing at Clark Air Base was smooth as silk, a stark contrast to their harrowing departure from the flooded strip. As the C-130 taxied toward the terminal, emergency vehicles and medical personnel waited under bright floodlights that cut through the lingering storm. But inside the cargo hold, something fundamental had shifted. The 8 SEALs who had boarded as desperate survivors were now looking at their pilot with something approaching reverence. Rodriguez was the first to act. Without speaking, he unclipped his personal water bottle, the same one he'd been rationing for the past 18 hours, expecting to die with it still half full. He walked forward and quietly placed it on the small table near the cockpit entrance. The gesture was simple but profound. In military culture, sharing your water during crisis situations represents the highest form of respect and trust. Williams followed suit, removing his emergency ration pack and adding it to the growing collection. Then Morrison contributed his backup radio battery. One by one, each SEAL offered something personal. Not because Laura needed their supplies, but because they needed to express gratitude that went beyond words. Ma'am, Chief Petty Officer Jackson called toward the cockpit. When we get stateside, my wife makes the best damn Texas chili this side of the Mississippi. You're invited to dinner, both you and your father's memory. Other voices joined in. My kids would love to meet you. My unit's having a reunion next month. You should come. Ma'am, if you ever need anything, and I mean anything, you've got 8 brothers who owe you everything. Laura's response came through the intercom, but her voice carried a slight tremor that hadn't been there during the most dangerous moments of their rescue. I appreciate that, gentlemen. Truly. But I was just doing my job. No, ma'am, Rodriguez corrected firmly. Your job was flying cargo runs in peacetime conditions. What you did tonight was something else entirely. Something that goes beyond duty assignments in military protocols. The cargo ramp began lowering, revealing the brightly lit terminal where medical teams and debriefing officers waited. But none of the SEALs moved toward the exit. Instead, they stood in respectful formation, waiting. Laura emerged from the cockpit, removing her flight helmet to reveal hair damp with perspiration and eyes that still carried the focused intensity of someone who just navigated through hell itself. She was smaller than most of them had imagined, but her presence filled the entire space. Without discussion or coordination, the 8 Navy SEALs came to attention simultaneously. It wasn't a formal military salute. It was something deeper, more personal. A recognition between warriors who understood what courage actually looked like when tested under impossible conditions. Laura paused, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Gentlemen, there's no need. Ma'am, Williams interrupted gently. With respect, there's every need. What you did tonight will be remembered long after the storm clouds clear, not just by us, but by everyone who hears this story. She nodded once, accepting their gratitude with the same quiet dignity she demonstrated while landing a 40-ton aircraft on a flooded runway in typhoon conditions. As they filed off the aircraft, each SEAL paused to shake her hand or offer a brief word of thanks. But their actions spoke louder than their words. The way they carried themselves, the respect in their voices, the careful attention they paid to her responses. Everything indicated that they understood they'd witnessed something extraordinary. The base commander was waiting at the bottom of the ramp, along with intelligence officers who would need detailed reports about the mission. But as Laura walked past the assembled officials, she heard something that made her pause. Behind her, one of the SEALs was speaking quietly to a maintenance sergeant. "Take good care of that bird. She just performed a miracle, and we want to make sure she's ready for the next one." The maintenance sergeant nodded with understanding. In military aviation, aircraft that save lives develop reputations that transcend their mechanical specifications. Laura's C-130 would receive special attention from now on, treated with the reverence reserved for machines that had proven themselves under fire. Have you ever witnessed someone risk everything to save others? 6 months after the Mindanao rescue, Captain Laura Hayes continued flying routine cargo missions throughout the Pacific Theater. Her official records showed nothing unusual about that storm-filled night. Just another successful evacuation operation filed away in military archives. But in the places that truly mattered, the story had taken on legendary status. Every Navy SEAL training class now heard about the flooded strip landing. Instructors would describe the impossible conditions, the calculated risks, and the pilot who refused to accept that 8 Americans were beyond rescue. They'd break down the physics involved. How a C-130 could hydroplane across a submerged runway? What kind of precision was required to execute such a maneuver without killing everyone aboard? Is she still flying rescue missions? New trainees would ask during late-night barracks discussions. She never stopped, instructors would reply with knowing smiles. The story had grown beyond the original participants. Other pilots began requesting weather condition waivers they never would have considered before. Rescue coordinators started exploring extraction options that pushed beyond conventional limitations. The entire special operations community had subtly shifted their definition of impossible. Laura's C-130 had been quietly transferred to the 353rd Special Operations Squadron, where it now carried the informal designation Storm Rider. Maintenance crews treated the aircraft with unusual care, and pilots who flew it reported that the controls felt different somehow. More responsive, more forgiving during difficult approaches. Colonel Morrison, the same officer who'd initially opposed the rescue attempt, now used Laura's mission as a case study in leadership courses. Sometimes, he would tell junior officers, courage means ignoring the voices that tell you something can't be done. Not recklessness, courage guided by skill and preparation. The silver patch that had belonged to her father was eventually retired to a place of honor in the Air Force Museum, displayed alongside other artifacts from heroic rescue operations. The placard read simply, Staff Sergeant Miguel Hayes, emergency pilot. Some fly to escape the storm, others fly to find those trapped within it. But Laura kept a photograph of the patch in her flight suit, along with a new addition, a small card signed by 8 Navy SEALs with a simple message, "Thank you for showing us that miracles still happen when courage meets capability." Rodriguez, now promoted to Master Chief, would occasionally visit airfields where Laura was stationed, not to bother her or request special treatment, but simply to ensure that someone remembered what she'd done. He'd speak quietly with maintenance crews, making sure they understood they were working on an aircraft that had saved lives under impossible conditions. That pilot, he'd tell them, landed a C-130 on a flooded runway in typhoon conditions because 8 Americans needed to come home. Take good care of her, bird. Williams, the 20-year veteran who'd recognized her father's legacy, established an informal network among special operations personnel. Whenever someone needed extraction from impossible situations, Laura's name would surface in planning discussions, not through official channels, but through the kind of word-of-mouth recommendations that carry more weight than any personnel file. The young female pilots now entering military service had a new role model, though Laura remained characteristically modest about her influence. When asked about inspiring the next generation, she would typically respond, "I hope they learn to fly better than I do, and that they never have to test their skills under the conditions I faced." But late at night, when storm systems moved across the Pacific and other pilots were grounding their aircraft, Laura could still be found studying weather patterns and calculating risk factors. Not because she was looking for dangerous missions, but because she understood that somewhere out there, people might need someone willing to fly when others couldn't. One evening, a young pilot approached her after a training session. "Ma'am, I heard about Mindanao. I wanted to ask, how did you know you could make that landing? How did you calculate the risks?" Laura considered the question carefully before responding. "I didn't know if I could make it work. I only knew that 8 good people would die if I didn't try. Sometimes courage isn't about knowing you'll succeed. It's about accepting responsibility when failure isn't an option. The young pilot nodded, understanding passing between them like shared recognition of duty that transcended personal safety. Courage isn't about flying above storms, Laura continued with quiet intensity. It's about landing when the storm says you can't. Comment respect if you believe one act of courage can change everything. Subscribe to HL Stories for more untold military stories of silent heroes.